Happy Thursday, everyone. So, we are finishing up our study of Chapter 26, the early years of the Cold War. And I mentioned yesterday that I thought it was kind of a strange chapter in that it ends in 1952. 1952 doesn't represent some grand seismic shift in history. The Cold War doesn't end in 1952. It does represent the end of President Truman's time in office, so that is a breaking point. But I think there is something to 1952 as a bit of a marker within the Cold War. So, to make sense out of this, I want to go back to where we started, which was trying to understand George Kennan, the American diplomat, um, his idea about containment and how that would help the United States ultimately defeat the Soviet Union. So, if I was going to try to summarize the whole idea of containment quickly, it's that his argument was the United States should take actions to try to prevent the Soviet Union from expanding geographically or from the communist ideology itself gaining favor around the world. Again, his view was that if the United States could defeat the Soviet Union in small conflicts around the world, or if our ideology could gain favor around the world, that in a sense would demonstrate that our systems, our democratic and our capitalistic systems, were by definition better. It's kind of the proof is in the pudding kind of an argument. If we win, therefore we must, or our systems must be better. And the view was that from Kennan and people who bought into the theory was that eventually the communist economic system and authoritarian government eventually would collapse from within, but that every time the United States was able to limit the expansion of the Soviet Union, it would clearly show everybody the weakness of the system. So Kennan believed eventually that the Soviet Union was going to collapse, that it was in a sense inevitable. Sounded like a good theory, but I promise you by 1952, Americans had a very difficult time buying into that theory. Not necessarily that our systems were superior, but that it was inevitable. So let's try to understand what the Cold War looked like by the end of President Truman's term in office. To do this, we're going to go to take a look at the Gallup polls. We've used Gallup's materials before, and Gallup has been asking a question week after week after week after week, going on 70, 80 years now. And the question is very simple. Do you approve of the job that President blank is doing? Again, so we have a long record of polling of how Americans feel about the job that their presidents are doing. So what you're seeing here are Gallup's polling of presidents going all the way back from President Truman to President Trump in the middle. So the higher that the line is on the chart shows the higher approval rating. So just looking at a couple of highlights, if we look at President Bush here, this would be 2000 President Bush, we see this kind of very interesting, starts off in the high or low mid 50s, a slight decline, and then a massive spike up into 80, high 80s and 90%. This is 9/11. You see 9/11 right in this chart. Of course, we see he had a bit of a tough run after that. Understatement. If we look at current President Trump, he's the one president who has yet to reach a 50% mark. He's really the only president who came into office with essentially a approval rating that was underwater, meaning that there were more Americans who disapproved than approved. But our focus is going to be on Harry Truman all the way back here. Again, Harry Truman came into office upon FDR's death during the middle of World War II, and there was a certain amount of kind of rallying around the new president and came into office as a very popular figure. But if you see, by the time he left office, he had approval ratings that touched down into the 20%. That meant only 1 out of 5 Americans said that the president was doing a good job. If you noticed, one of the sections in Chapter 26 was called to err is Truman, a play on the words, the phrase to err is human. Let me go back to, so Truman left office incredibly unpopular, and thinking about how Americans were thinking at the time, this isn't that crazy. This is the Cold War. This is seen as this kind of life and death struggle for the future of government and economics around the world, and for a lot of people, in a sense, the very American way of life. So During his time in office, as you finished up reading, you had one of America's largest, not closest, but largest allies, China, their non-communist government fall to um, the Communist Party and their leader Mao Zedong. So this was a massive strike against President Truman. We had the invasion of South Korea by North Korea, and by the time he left office in 1952, the war essentially had reached a stalemate. It was very clear that there was not going to be an American victory at this point. Um, McCarthyism was still in full swing. He had yet to kind of hit his nadir during the Army McCarthy hearings. So when he left office, there was no inclination that the United States was anywhere close to winning the Cold War. So the emphasis here of where this applies, and this is going to come up, kind of reference a little bit of the historiography of Rock yesterday, is what the Cold War did to American thinking. So it seemed pretty clear that to people at the time that the Cold War established what some people would call a duality. Duality meaning that there's clearly two sides. On one side, there's the United States political and economic systems, democracy and free market capitalism, and on the other side, there was Soviet political and economic systems. Usually people would simply, at the time, would simply say communist, but if we're talking their political system, it's a more authoritarian style of government. But people simply referred to it as communist. As a result of this, in terms of how Americans increasingly thought, if something was deemed quote unquote American, by definition, it became good. So if you've heard again the phrase, as American as apple pie, well, American, yes, we've discussed this, it's a place, but it became a catch all term for something that is good. And those things that were not seen as quote unquote American became seen as dangerous, evil, subversive. The phrase often, or a kind of epithet that was often thrown around, was simply to call something communist, or more pejoratively, commie. So thinking back to, I had you read the Nebraska Public School Teachers Loyalty Oath. Nothing special about the Nebraska one. Similar things like this popped up all over the United States. But there was an emphasis on teaching the policies that clearly made America great. And in a lot of the responses I gave you, to me, the bigger point here is that apparently there was some universal idea over what exactly it was that had allowed America to rise to its level of greatness by the 1950s. That's a very, what we would call a consensus view, the idea that, well, of course everybody agrees on what those are. So as a result of this, increasingly, for people who advocated for change to some aspect of American society, to criticize some part of American life, increasingly was able to be painted by opponents of that change as dangerous, not just different, not just people fighting for their rights, but as actually dangerous. So what we would see often is different social movements would be characterized as communist, even though it had not necessarily anything to do with a communist economic system. Because again, increasingly to be American was good, and to be bad or to advocate for change was quote unquote commie. So we saw the civil rights leaders often referred to as communists. We saw the labor movement increasingly characterized as communist, although again, this is not a new thing. The feminist movement increasingly characterized as communist. So increasingly anything that advocated for change, anything different from what had existed in the past, was painted, again, not just as different, but as somehow dangerous, as subversive to the American way of life. And we see this within the field of history itself. I know we studied first semester these different schools of historiographical thought. In the early 1900s, we had the rise of progressive historiography, where historians increasingly were looking at what were the conflicts within the American system, or the American history, that kind of moved the needle, that moved history forward. This was a departure from the old idea of understanding history just through biography. So as a result of the progressive movement that was going on at the time, looking at the ways in which industrialization and urbanization was affecting people's lives, historians started to wonder, well, what other major changes happened that were dividing Americans? But during the 1950s, history itself started to focus on these shared American values, the same ideas that popped up in the Nebraska public school teachers' loyalty oath. This idea of that Americans are generally supportive of all of our democratic institutions and that they're generally supportive of our tradition of free trade. So the progressive historiographical ideas of trying to understand the conflicts within the United States, conflicts that we've explored, the concepts of labor versus ownership, the concept that sometimes what urban Americans desire may be different from what rural Americans desire. Certainly, different values held in the northern part of the United States versus the south. A whole bunch of other conflicts. During the 1950s, these conflicts were diminished, not ignored, not saying that they did not exist, but historians increasingly came to believe that across these groups, in between labor and ownership and North versus South, there was still support for some fundamental ideas. So history began to write towards those fundamental ideas, and what some historians have called a flattening of American history. What they meant by that is that some of the more dynamic, more revolutionary time periods where there seemed to be a lot of change were flattened. They were seen as less significant. So the populist movement in the 19 teens and 1920s and 30s was written about as an attempt to have a real revolution to give power to rural Americans, to change the nature of our government system itself, to get rid of tariffs, to give people direct power over or giving them the direct power to vote for their own senators. So these were some pretty significant ideas, according to the progressive school of thought. From this consensus politics, it saw it as less revolutionary. They said, no. The farmers weren't trying to have a revolution. They just wanted a greater stake in the democratic system that already existed. That the dispute between urban and rural was really a matter of detail, not of fundamental substance. So this new consensus in the 1950s tended to emphasize the aspects of American history that demonstrated the unity across different groups of people, that demonstrated stability of the system itself, that these eras of change were not that important as to the original ideas in the first place. The new consensus school emphasized the continuity of American life. And even going back to George Kennan's article in which he advocated for this idea of containment, his last paragraph said, all the United States really needs to do is to live up to our best traditions. And that's the best way that we can contain communism. So that itself is kind of a conservative, that doesn't mean Democrat or Republican, but conservative view in that, well, nothing needs to fundamentally change. The way that the United States is good enough. So this was the movement in history at the time. Going